The static hissed like a cornered snake. On the main screen of the Tactical Operations Center, a satellite feed flickered, pixels struggling against the encroaching digital noise. For green diamonds, designated Trident 1 through 4, were clustered behind a crumbling rock formation labeled Objective Viper. A swarm of red icons, dozens of them, was closing in, a tide of digital death. The only thing moving faster was the monstrous, rust-colored smear expanding from the west. A haboob, a wall of sand and fury churning toward the battlespace at 60 knots. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his jaw a knot of granite. The veins on his temples pulsed in time with the urgent clicks of the comms technicians. "What's the status on air support?" he barked, his voice cutting through the low hum of the command tent. "Negative, sir," a young lieutenant answered, not looking up from his console. "All assets are grounded. The storm front is moving faster than projected. Dust ingestion will flame out the F-15s, and the Pave-Lows can't risk the brownout. Nothing can fly in that." Thorne's gaze swept the room, a silent demand for a solution that didn't exist. His eyes passed over a figure standing near the exit, half-shrouded in shadow. Chief Warrant Officer 3 Anya Sharma watched the screen, her expression unreadable. She was a pilot without a posting, assigned to this forward operating base as a technical advisor for the aging Apache fleet, a duty everyone knew was a form of professional purgatory. Her flight jacket was worn, the leather creased, the name tag Sharma faded almost to invisibility. She didn't look at the colonel. Her focus was entirely on the map, her mind tracing invisible lines through the terrain data overlay. "Sir, Trident Lead is on the line," the comms tech announced. The hiss intensified, and a strained voice filled the tent. "Sun Devil, this is Trident 1. We are compromised. I repeat, compromised. Enemy has us pinned down. We're taking effective fire from 3 sides. We need immediate extraction or close air support." "How copy?" Thorne grabbed the handset. "Trident 1, this is Sun Devil. Air is Redcon, I repeat, Redcon. That storm is 10 minutes out. What's your ammo situation?" The voice came back, punctuated by the distant rattle of gunfire. "Black on 556. Down to our last belts for the 240. We can't hold this position for long." "Understood, Trident," Thorne said, his voice grim. "Start prepping for ENE. We'll shift to a recovery operation once the storm passes." A collective intake of breath went through the TOC. A recovery operation meant the SEALs were being written off. It was a death sentence delivered over a secure radio link. In the corner, Anya Sharma took a quiet step forward, moving from the shadows into the sterile light of the monitors. Her movement was so deliberate it barely registered, yet it drew the eye. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the radio and the hum of the servers. "Colonel," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of panic. "There's a window." Thorne turned, his expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise. He hadn't expected her to speak. Sharma was a ghost on this base, a quiet officer who did her work and kept to herself. He saw her as a relic, much like the H-64D she was supposedly advising on, a bird from a bygone era of analog skill in a digital air force. He still remembered the report that had landed her here. A mission in another theater where she had disobeyed a direct order to break off, flying through an unforecasted electrical storm to pull a pinned ranger squad off a mountainside. She'd saved them all, but the inquiry cited her reckless disregard for protocol and equipment limitations. It was a black mark she could never erase. "A window to what, warrant officer?" Thorne asked, his tone laced with condescending patience. "Pour a cup of coffee." Anya ignored the jab. She pointed a finger at a secondary monitor displaying a high-resolution topographical map. A deep, winding canyon system, the locals called it the Serpent Spine, snaked its way from the FOB's perimeter directly toward the SEAL's position. The haboob is a surface phenomenon. The main wall is 10,000 feet high, but the ground winds will follow the terrain. The canyon will act as a funnel. It will be violent, but the airflow will be predictable. It's a corridor. A major sitting beside the lieutenant scoffed. A corridor of rock and sand moving at hurricane speeds. You'd be flying blind. The avionics would go haywire. The new systems would. Anya corrected him quietly. The AH-64ES sensor suite would get overwhelmed by particle saturation. It would try to compensate, flood the pilot with conflicting data, and fly itself into a wall. But my bird, she's an old Delta model. Her TADS/PNVS is less sensitive. It's a cruder system, which means it's less likely to be blinded. I can filter the noise manually. I can fly it on instruments and instinct. Thorne's face hardened. He saw not a solution, but the same reckless pattern repeating itself. Your bird, Sharma? You're not even cleared for combat sorties. You're here to consult on maintenance schedules. And that Apache you're referring to is a hangar queen, 2 decades old and slated for decommissioning. You want to fly a museum piece into the teeth of a sandstorm based on a gut feeling? It's not a gut feeling, sir, Anya replied, her calm unwavering. It's a calculation. The canyon walls are granite. They'll provide a clear enough return on the millimeter wave radar for terrain following. The wind, while strong, will be laminar within the canyon, not turbulent. It's a high-risk ingress, but it's tactically sound. It's their only chance. The comms crackled again, Trident One's voice more urgent now. Sun Devil, they're massing for a final assault. We need something now. Thorne looked from the desperate icons on the screen to the quiet woman standing before him. He saw insubordination, a pilot who thought she knew better than the entire command structure. He saw the ghost of the report that had exiled her to this forgotten outpost. Your request is denied, warrant officer, he said, his voice cold and final. You are a maintenance consultant. Go consult on some maintenance. That is a direct order. Now get out of my TOC. For a moment, Anya held his gaze. There was no anger in her eyes, no defiance. There was only a profound, chilling certainty. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, turned without another word, and walked out of the tent, disappearing back into the growing twilight and the moaning of the rising wind. Thorne turned back to the map, a man trying to convince himself he had just made the right decision, the only decision a commander could make. But the image of her unwavering eyes lingered, a silent accusation he couldn't shake. The storm was coming, and with it, a choice had already been made. Anya walked across the flight line, the wind already whipping sand into the air, stinging her exposed skin. The sky was a bruised purple, the leading edge of the haboob a terrifying, towering wall of ochre that seemed to swallow the horizon. The roar of the approaching storm was a low-frequency hum that vibrated in her bones. She didn't head for the barracks or the mess hall. Her steps were sure, leading her to the solitary, canvas-draped shape at the far end of the tarmac, Hangar 7. Inside, the cavernous space was quiet except for the groaning of the metal roof under the strain of the wind. Bathed in the cold, green glow of the emergency lights sat her Apache, call sign Valkyrie 9. It was an older H-64D model, its olive-drab skin scarred and patched. It lacked the sleek, sensor-heavy bulges of the newer Echo models parked in the main hangars. This machine was a warrior from a different age, a machine of steel and wire and hydraulic fluid, where the pilot was not a systems manager but an integral component. Sergeant Leo Graves, her crew chief, was running a final diagnostic on the port engine, his face illuminated by the glow of his tough book. He was young, barely 23, with a mechanic's intuition that defied his age. He'd been assigned to Anya and Valkyrie 9 for 6 months, and in that time he'd learned more about the soul of a machine than he had in all his technical training. He looked up as she approached, his expression questioning. "Colonel's a no-go, Chief?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "He made his decision," Anya said, her voice neutral. She ran a hand along the helicopter's fuselage, her fingers tracing the faint outline of a rivet line. "How's she running?" "Purring like a lioness," Graves said, closing the laptop. "I rerouted the secondary ECU through the analog bypass like you showed me. Should keep the dust from frying her brain. Fuel is topped off. Slugs for the 30 mil are HEI. Pods are loaded with a mix of Kilo and Romeo model Hellfires. She's ready to hunt, he paused, his gaze meeting hers. The question is, are you? Anya didn't answer directly. She moved toward the cockpit, her hands stopping on a small, faded painting just below the canopy. It was a bird of prey, a nighthawk, rendered in stark black and gray. Its wings were swept back in a dive, its eyes fierce and focused. It was her grandfather's insignia. He had been a test pilot in the 60s, a man who flew experimental craft into hurricanes and thunderheads just to see where they would break. He taught her that a machine had its limits, printed in a manual, but a pilot and her machine, bonded by trust and understanding, could rewrite those limits. The Nighthawk was a promise, to fly with purpose, to push the edge, to never leave anyone behind. She touched the painted wing with 2 fingers, a silent communion. "Let's get her unbuttoned, Leo," she said softly. Graves nodded, no further questions needed. He knew that look in her eyes. It was the same look he imagined her grandfather had before climbing into some winged monstrosity built of slide rules and dreams. Together, they began the pre-flight ritual. Anya moved with an unhurried, methodical grace. She pulled on her flight suit, the Nomex whispering as she zipped it up. She strapped the survival vest over her torso, the weight familiar and comforting. Each buckle clicked into place with a definitive snap. She inspected the ammunition feed for the 30mm chain gun herself, running a gloved hand over the linked rounds. Graves, meanwhile, was pulling the chocks and disconnecting the ground power unit, his movements a mirror of her own efficiency. She climbed into the front seat, the gunner's position which she preferred for solo flights. The cockpit enveloped her, a cramped world of screens, switches, and the faint smell of hydraulic fluid and ozone. She strapped herself in, the 5-point harness cinching tight, making her one with the machine. Her hands moved over the controls, a concert of muscle memory. Power on. Avionics warm. Auxiliary power unit engaged with a rising whine that built into a roar. She lowered the helmet-mounted display over her right eye, and the world dissolved into a green-tinted overlay of targeting data and flight telemetry. The machine was waking up. Through the canopy, she saw Graves give her a thumbs up, his face grim but resolute. He was her ally, the only one she needed. She was no longer just a maintenance consultant. She was a pilot, and her machine was alive. The storm was not an obstacle. It was an opportunity. It was cover. The whine of the twin General Electric T-700 turbines escalated into a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the hangar. Anya eased the collective up, and the 22,000-pound attack helicopter grew light on its struts. Without a word to the control tower, without filing a flight plan, she lifted into a low hover, the rotor wash blasting dust and loose debris across the concrete floor. Graves shielded his eyes, standing his ground as she pivoted the aircraft toward the massive hangar doors. He hit the control panel, and the doors groaned open, revealing a wall of roiling, impenetrable brown. The world outside had become an apocalypse of sand. Anya didn't hesitate. She nudged the cyclic forward, and Valkyrie 9 surged out of the relative calm of the hangar and plunged directly into the maelstrom. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. The helicopter was seized by the wind, a violent jolt that slammed Anya against her harness. The roar of the engines was immediately swallowed by the shriek of sandblasted air screaming past the canopy. It sounded like the universe was being torn apart. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. The world beyond her cockpit was a solid, churning mass of sand. For any other pilot in any other aircraft, this would have been a death sentence. Her hands were fluid on the controls, her inputs small and precise, anticipating the wind's chaotic whims rather than reacting to them. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was dancing with it. The helmet-mounted display became her entire world, a ghostly green grid overlaying the blackness. The forward-looking infrared camera was useless, blinded by the thermal chaos. But the millimeter-wave radar, the older, less refined system Thorne had dismissed, was her salvation. It painted a crude but intelligible picture of the world ahead, rendering the canyon walls as shimmering, ghost-like curtains on either side of her. Altitude, 50 feet. Airspeed, 90 knots. She murmured to herself, her voice a steady anchor in the violent chaos. The helicopter bucked and shuddered, the rotor blades groaning under the aerodynamic load. Sand particles, driven by the ferocious wind, scoured the armored glass of the canopy. Each impact a tiny, sharp crack. It was like flying through a grinder. An alarm blared, engine temperature rising. She adjusted the fuel mixture, leaning it out just enough to cool the turbines without sacrificing power. It was a delicate balance, a trick her grandfather had taught her, one not found in any flight manual. She was deep inside the serpent's spine now, a ghost in a machine navigating a subterranean river of wind. The canyon walls, only a few dozen feet from her rotor tips on either side, rushed past as blurry green lines on her display. She flew by feel, by the vibrations coming up through the floorboards and the cyclic stick, by the subtle shifts in the engine's pitch. The machine was talking to her, telling her where the pressure was, where the strain was greatest. And she was listening. She was no longer Anya Sharma, the disgraced warrant officer. She was Nyx, a creature of the dark, and this storm was her domain. The seals were 10 miles out. At her current speed, that was less than 7 minutes away. The race against time had become a waltz with death in the dark. On the ground, Lieutenant Commander Jake Riptide Evans pressed himself against the hot rock, the stock of his rifle slick with sweat. The air was thick with cordite and fear. Mortar rounds were walking their way up the ridge, each explosion a deafening cough that sent rock splinters flying like shrapnel. His radio man was dead. 2 more of his men were wounded. They had maybe 5 minutes of fight left in them before they were completely overrun. "Last mag!" shouted one of his men, his voice tight with desperation. Jake watched as an enemy technical, a pickup truck with a DSHK heavy machine gun bolted to the bed, maneuvered onto their exposed flank. It was the killing blow. Once that gun opened up, it would tear through their meager cover and cut them to pieces. He raised his rifle, knowing it was a futile gesture. The range was too great, the target too well armored. He took a breath, preparing to give the order to sell their lives as dearly as possible. This was it. And then the sky ripped open. It wasn't thunder. It was a sound he'd never heard before. A hellish shriek that seemed to come from inside the sandstorm itself. Out of the brown, roiling chaos, a single black streak materialized. It moved with impossible speed, a thin line of smoke trailing behind it. The Hellfire missile, flying blind but guided by an unseen hand, slammed into the technical with cataclysmic force. The truck vaporized in a blossom of fire and twisted metal, the explosion a silent flash in the sand-choked air, the sound arriving a second later as a concussive boom that shook the very ground. Jake and his men stared, stunned into silence. Where had it come from? Air support was scrubbed. Nothing could be flying in this. It had to be a ghost, a mirage born of stress and dehydration. But the burning wreckage on their flank was undeniably real. A new voice, calm and female, cut through the static on his command channel. "Trident 1, this is Nyx. I am on station. How copy?" Jake fumbled for his handset, his mind struggling to process the call sign. Nyx. The name was a legend, a whisper from the early days in the sandbox. A pilot who flew an old bird, who appeared in impossible weather, who turned certain death into improbable victory. He'd thought it was just a myth, a campfire story grunts told to keep their spirits up. "Nyx, this is Trident 1, he stammered, his voice hoarse. "We copy. Solid copy. Who are you? Where are you?" "I'm right above you," the voice replied, as serene as if she were ordering lunch. "Marking targets for 30 millimeter. Advise you keep your heads down." Before he could respond, the air in front of their position erupted. A torrent of high-explosive incendiary rounds, invisible in the dust, tore into the enemy fighters who had been massing for the final assault. The 30 millimeters chain gun of the Apache, firing at a blistering 600 rounds per minute, was a scythe of pure destruction. It didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like a colossal sheet of steel being ripped in half. Bodies were thrown, positions disintegrated, and the enemy attack dissolved from a coordinated assault into a panicked rout in seconds. The SEALs could only watch in awe, crouched behind their rocks as salvation rained down from a sky that should have been empty. They couldn't see the helicopter. They could only feel its presence, a guardian angel cloaked in a hurricane of sand and death. In the TOC, the mood had shifted from grim acceptance to frantic confusion. The explosion of the technical had registered as a massive thermal spike on their sensors, followed by the unmistakable audio signature of a GU-8 Avenger's little brother, the M230 chain gun. A rogue signal had appeared on their screens, a single IFF tag squawking from the heart of the storm, V9, Valkyrie 9. "It's Sharma," the lieutenant said, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "Sir, it's Warrant Officer Sharma." She took the bird. Colonel Thorne stared at the screen, his face a mask of cold fury. She had disobeyed a direct order. She had taken a multimillion-dollar asset and flown it into conditions that would tear it apart. He should have been incandescent with rage, ready to have her court-martialed the second she landed, if she landed at all. But under the anger, a different feeling was taking root. A cold, grudging awe. The green diamonds of Trident Team were no longer being squeezed by the red tide. The red icons were scattering, breaking. She was doing it. The impossible was happening on his watch, broadcast in real time. "Get me a channel to that aircraft," Thorne ordered, his voice tight. "Nix, this is Sun Devil," he transmitted, his professional calm belying the turmoil in his mind. "You are flying an unauthorized sortie in direct violation of my orders. Acknowledge." Anya's voice came back, utterly unruffled by his authority. "Sun Devil, this is Nix. I am currently engaged with hostile forces in defense of friendly assets. All other traffic is secondary. Out." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her reply left Thorne speechless. She had not only disobeyed him, she had dismissed him. On the ground, the enemy, recovering from the initial shock, began to adapt. They were not a disorganized militia. They were trained fighters. They realized the helicopter was flying low, trapped within the canyon. Suddenly, the sky, even the dusty, invisible sky, became a lattice of streaking trails of smoke. Manpads, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. Nix, multiple launches detected. Jake yelled into his radio, watching the terrifying corkscrews of smoke rise into the brown haze. "I see them," Anya's voice replied, still unervingly calm. In the cockpit, her flare and chaff dispensers were firing automatically, spitting out bursts of incandescent magnesium and strips of aluminum to confuse the missile seekers. An alarm screamed as a missile locked on. She threw the Apache into a violent sideways slide, a maneuver that should have been impossible at this low altitude, pulling crushing G-forces. The missile, a heat seeker, roared past her canopy, missing by mere feet before detonating against the far canyon wall. Another missile streaked toward her. This time she couldn't evade. Instead, she did something insane. She pitched the nose down and fired a volley of rockets directly into the ground in front of her. The explosions kicked up a massive, temporary cloud of superheated dust and rock, a thermal blanket that blinded the missile seeker at the last second. It lost its lock and flew harmlessly into the storm. She was using the battlefield itself as a countermeasure. Thorne watched the telemetry in the TOC, his knuckles white. She wasn't just flying. She was rewriting the book on aerial combat. The doubt in his mind was being systematically, violently erased, replaced by a terrifying respect. The enemy commander, a man known for his brutality and tactical cunning, realized the battle was lost. The mysterious gunship had shattered his forces' morale and cohesion. His only option was to escape and fight another day. He and his personal guard scrambled into a BTR, a heavy, 8-wheeled armored personnel carrier, and gunned it toward a narrow pass at the far end of the canyon. "Nix, HVT is bugging out," Jake reported, marking the vehicle's location on his datapad. "He's in an armored BTR heading east through the pass. We can't get a shot." In the cockpit, Anya saw it too. The BTR was a hardened target. Her 30mm rounds would just bounce off its thick armor. She needed a hellfire, She tried to get a laser designation on the vehicle, but the dust was too thick, scattering the beam. The missile wouldn't be able to lock. The BTR was pulling away, about to disappear behind a massive rock spur. She had only seconds to act. There was only one option left. It was dangerous, reckless, and her grandfather would have loved it. Trident 1, hold on to your helmets, she said over the radio, her voice hardening with resolve. She pulled back hard on the collective, feeding power to the rotors. Valkyrie 9 shot upward, climbing out of the relative safety of the low canyon floor. She broke through the densest layer of the storm and rose above the ridgeline. For 3 terrifying seconds, she was exposed, silhouetted against the swirling brown sky, a perfect target for every enemy gunner left on the field. But the enemy wasn't looking for her up there. They were looking for a ghost in the canyon below. Even the SEALs froze, their heads snapping up as the iconic, predatory shape of the Apache rose like a vengeful god above the ridge. It hung there for a heartbeat, a black dragon emerging from a sea of sand. Then its nose dipped, and the 30mm chain gun erupted in a torrent of fire and fury. Freed from the confines of the canyon, Anya had a clear line of sight. She didn't need a missile. She put the targeting reticle of her helmet display directly over the BTR's engine block and squeezed the trigger. The high-explosive rounds stitched a perfect line across the vehicle's rear deck. They ripped through the thinner top armor, shredding engine components, fuel lines, and ammunition. The BTR faltered, then erupted in a massive secondary explosion as its own munitions cooked off. The shockwave rolled down the canyon, a final, definitive full stop to the battle. The attack was over. The HVT was gone. Anya immediately plunged the Apache back down behind the ridge, disappearing into the storm as quickly as she had appeared. The entire maneuver, from ascent to destruction to descent, had taken less than 5 seconds. It was an act of impossible audacity and breathtaking skill. On the ground, Jake Evans lowered his rifle, a slow smile spreading across his dust-caked face. The myth was real. With the enemy command structure shattered and their heavy weapons destroyed, the remaining fighters broke and fled into the storm. The immediate threat to Trident Team had evaporated. But they were still miles from safety, low on supplies, and with 2 wounded men. The battle was won, but survival was not yet guaranteed. "Nix, the field is yours," Jake radioed, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. "We're breaking contact and moving to the pre-planned extraction point, grid 749 to 921. Can you cover our 6? "Affirmative, Trident 1. Anya's voice returned, the calm in her tone, a stark contrast to the violence she had just unleashed. "I'll sanitize your exfil route. Move now." The Apache became their overwatch, their unseen shepherd. As the SEALs began their tactical withdrawal, leapfrogging from one piece of cover to the next, Anya patrolled the canyon ahead of them. Her sensors, now clear of the manpad threat, could pick out the thermal signatures of enemy remnants trying to regroup for an ambush. She didn't engage with overwhelming force. Her actions were surgical, economical. A short, controlled burst of the chain gun would dissuade a squad trying to set up a machine gun nest. A single high-explosive rocket, perfectly placed, would collapse a rock overhang, blocking a path of pursuit. She became a ghost in their machine, her voice on the radio a constant, reassuring presence. "Trident, be advised, 4 hostiles in the rocks, 200 meters at your 1 o'clock. I'm putting a rocket on them. Stand by." Splash. "The route is clear." She guided them through the maze of rock and sand, her perspective from above giving her a god's eye view of the battlefield they were leaving behind. She was their eyes and their sword, creating a moving perimeter of destruction that kept the enemy scattered and terrified. The SEALs, masters of ground combat, moved with renewed confidence, secure in the knowledge that the sky, their greatest vulnerability just minutes before, was now their most powerful asset. They moved faster and more efficiently than Jake had ever seen, their trust in the unseen pilot absolute. In the cockpit, Anya was managing a dozen different crises at once. The sand ingestion had pushed the engines to their thermal limits. A warning light for the main transmission fluid pressure was flickering ominously. The canopy was so sandblasted it was becoming opaque, forcing her to rely entirely on her helmet display. She flew with one hand on the cyclic, the other constantly adjusting power settings, sensor filters, and communication frequencies. She was not just flying the helicopter. She was keeping it alive through sheer force of will, coaxing the last dregs of performance out of the aging machine. She felt the strain in her own body, her muscles aching from the constant tension, her eyes burning from the focus. But the 4 green diamonds on her moving map were getting closer and closer to the extraction zone. That was the only thing that mattered. She had made a promise to the Nighthawk on her fuselage, and she would not break it. The silence in the Tactical Operations Center was absolute. Every officer, every technician, every analyst in the room was frozen, their eyes glued to the main screen. They listened to the calm, clipped radio transmissions between the pilot and the SEAL team leader, a conversation that was rewriting the outcome of the day. The red icons representing the enemy had vanished, either destroyed or in full retreat. The 4 green diamonds of Trident team were moving steadily toward the designated extraction point. Colonel Thorne stood motionless, the dead radio handset still clutched in his hand. He had been a commander for 20 years. He had sent men on missions from which they had not returned. He had made hard calls, impossible calls, and had learned to live with the ghosts they created. But he had never witnessed anything like this. He had witnessed a single soldier, in a single obsolete machine, disobey a direct order and single-handedly turn a catastrophic failure into a textbook victory. He had dismissed her. He had insulted her. He had ordered her out of his presence. And she had responded by saving 4 of the most elite operators in his command. The young lieutenant at the comm station, his earlier nervousness replaced by wide-eyed awe, turned to Thorne. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Trident 1 is on the line for you." Thorne nodded, taking the offered handset. He cleared his throat. "Trident 1, this is Sun Devil. Go ahead." Jake Evans's voice came through, raw with exhaustion but ringing with a profound, unshakable respect. "Sun Devil, be advised, Trident is secure at the LZ. We are green across the board, casualties are stable. The storm is beginning to break. We're ready for pickup." He paused, and the background noise of the wind seemed to die down for a moment. "Sir, I need to know who is flying that bird. I've heard stories, but who is Nyx?" The name hung in the air of the TOC. Nyx, the night goddess, the bringer of darkness and protector of those within it. A legend made real. Thorne looked at his monitor, where someone had finally pulled up Anya Sharma's full service record. The screen was filled with commendations for valor, citations for exceptional airmanship, and glowing after-action reports from commanders in forgotten war zones. And then he saw the addendum, the black mark, the official reprimand for the mission where she had flown into the electrical storm. The reason for the reprimand read, "Endangering a vital air asset by operating outside of established safety parameters, the result of her actions." Listed in a smaller font below, read, "Resulted in the successful rescue of 12 U.S. Army Rangers with 0 friendly casualties." Thorne looked at the screen, at the 2 conflicting statements that summed up Anya Sharma's career. A hero punished for her heroism by a system that feared outliers. He finally understood. She wasn't reckless. She simply operated on a level of skill and instinct that the rulebooks could not account for. "She's one of ours, Trident," Thorne said into the radio, his voice heavy with a new understanding. "Her name is Warrant Officer Sharma, and her call sign is Nyx." He looked at the rapt faces around him. "Let the record show that Valkyrie 9, on my authority, conducted a close air support and combat search and rescue operation. Her actions today were exemplary." He was rewriting the record, erasing the stain of his own dismissal in real time. It was the only thing he could do. "Nyx," he said, switching channels. "You are cleared to return to base. Godspeed." The last rays of the setting sun broke through the dissipating haboob, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The wind had died down to a whisper, leaving behind a world blanketed in a fine layer of red dust. Valkyrie 9 approached the FOB low and slow, its familiar silhouette a welcome sight against the bruised sky. It did not land with the crisp precision of the other Apaches. It settled onto the tarmac with a heavy, weary sigh, the undercarriage groaning in protest. The machine was a wreck. The leading edges of the rotor blades were stripped down to the composite. The canopy was a translucent, sandblasted mess. Dust and sand clogged every intake, every seam, every crevice. The Nighthawk emblem on the side was barely visible under a thick coat of grime. It was a helicopter that had flown through hell and come back scarred but unbroken. Anya initiated the shutdown sequence. The roar of the turbines spooled down to a whine, then a series of clicks, and finally silence. The sudden quiet was deafening. For hours, her world had been a symphony of engine noise, wind shear, and weapons fire. Now, there was only the faint ringing in her ears and the gentle ticking of cooling metal. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands still resting on the controls, feeling the last vestiges of life drain from the machine. She was no longer Nyx. She was Anya Sharma again, a pilot on the ground. She unstrapped herself and climbed out, her movements stiff. Sergeant Graves was there, waiting. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the front of the aircraft and placed a hand on the nose. His expression a mix of horror at the damage and profound respect for the pilot who had brought it home. He looked at Anya, and in his eyes, she saw everything she needed. It was an acknowledgement deeper than any medal or citation. She was walking toward the debriefing hangar when Colonel Thorne intercepted her. He stood in her path, his uniform immaculate, a stark contrast to her own dust-covered, sweat-stained flight suit. She stopped, her expression neutral, ready for the reprimand, the court-martial, the end of her career. Thorne didn't speak for a long time. He simply looked at her, his gaze traveling from her tired eyes to the battered helicopter behind her. The fury was gone from his face, replaced by something she couldn't quite read. It might have been respect. It might have been shame. "Your report will state," he said finally, his voice low and formal, "that you were acting on my verbal authorization, which was not recorded due to communications failure caused by the storm." He was giving her an out, protecting her from the consequences of her insubordination. More than that, he was taking responsibility. "That won't be necessary, sir," Anya replied, her voice quiet but firm. "My report will state the truth." Thorne's jaw tightened. He had expected her to take the lifeline. Instead, she stood by her actions, ready to face the fallout. It was in that moment that he truly saw her, not as a reckless subordinate, but as an officer of unshakable integrity. He nodded slowly. "As you wish, warrant officer." He held out a datapad. "This is your new duty assignment. Effective immediately. You are a flight lead for this detachment. Your call sign is your own." He wasn't just reinstating her. He was promoting her. Anya took the datapad but didn't look at it. Her gaze was on her helicopter. Thorne followed her eyes to the scarred machine. He walked over to it, his polished boots leaving dark prints in the fine red dust. He stopped beside the cockpit and placed his hand flat against the fuselage, right next to the faded Nighthawk. It was a gesture of communion, of acknowledgement, a silent salute from one warrior to another. He looked at Anya one last time, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and walked away. Anya was alone on the flight line as the last light faded from the sky. The desert air grew cold. She walked to her Apache and leaned against its wounded frame, the cooling metal a comfort against her back. She looked up at the first stars beginning to appear in the clear, dark sky. The wind whispered around the silent aircraft, carrying with it the scent of ozone, dust, and distant rain. Her dignity was intact. Her purpose was clear. The Nighthawk was home.